Welcome back, everyone. So, today I'm going to talk about some of the historical events that are covered in Chapter 17 of Give Me Liberty. And as I've done before, I'm not going to go into all of the specifics of each event, but just kind of cover some highlights to help you navigate all of the material of that chapter and to give you a couple of local connections to this historical this broad national historical story. So these are the three areas we're going to talk about: is the rise of the populist movement, the rise of Jim Crow, and the Chinese Exclusion Acts. And as you can see from this is a cartoon that came out at about the time that the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed. I think it has a really interesting relevance for us today with all of our discussion of the wall, right, of the border wall, and how that has come to kind of symbolize our immigration debate. Well, it wasn't in some ways imagined that differently in the 1880s, and as we talk more about it, I think you'll find more connections. But first, I want to talk a little bit about the rise of populism. So when we talked in our meeting this past week, we've talked a lot about this kind of rising discontent with the inequality of the sort of uncontrolled capitalism of the late 19th century, of the Gilded Age. And even though we focused mainly on how that was happening in northeastern cities, this is also happening throughout the South and the West. And so the textbook talks a lot about this organization called the Farmers Alliance and notes that it was the largest citizens movement of the 19th century. That's pretty incredible to consider. You know, how many people were joining this effort to reform a system that they thought essentially had kind of everything sort of stacked against them. The sharecropping system, which, as you may know, is a system of sort of leasing land from a property owner. Often these were formerly enslaved people who were leasing land from former plantation owners. And you would also lease the tools and things like that. And the idea was that you would give them some of the profits, but then you would keep enough of the profits yourself that you could make a living. But what happened in reality was that most sharecroppers were in debt. And there were kind of global reasons for this. There was more sort of cotton coming from India and things like that. So the prices of some of these goods, like cotton and wheat, were declining as well. So that was part of the problem, but it was really a system that was kind of set up to keep a lot of these farmers in debt. And so as they were experiencing this kind of economic insecurity, they were calling on the federal government to enact greater reforms. Now, the Farmers Alliance wasn't initially a political organization, as the textbook notes, but it becomes political and actually starts in Texas, as you can see here, their flag in 1878. But then it extends to many other states. It becomes a political party when it becomes something called the People's Party. And it was one of the most successful third parties in American history. It called for a kind of platform of abolishing national banks because, of course, the banks were where all of these farmers were indebted, and for the government ownership of railroads and telegraphs, because they could see that the concentration of power in those industries and land, and those were the entities, especially the railroad companies, that owned a lot of the land. That's why they were calling for government ownership rather than private ownership of those entities. They were calling for free silver. Again, this was a way of, they saw this as a way of kind of, if you move away from the gold standard, you'll have a way to better, to have more cash flow. It will help farmers make a living. But they also called for other kind of democratic reforms, like that senators be elected by popular vote rather than by legislatures. And of course, that was something that ultimately did happen a bit later, but that was one of the things that they were calling for. And what we also, another thing that was actually enacted later is a graduated income tax. So this idea that you tax people that make more money, they pay a higher tax rate than people who make less money. That is this, we have a graduated income tax system today, and those ideas kind of started with the People's Party. And in 1894, as the textbook talks about, there is a major kind of protest. It eventually gets broken up by the military, but it's called, Jacob Coxey was a kind of leader of this movement, and his movement was sometimes called Coxey's Army. And you can see here when he gives his address to the people, he is again kind of recalling some of these founding documents of the country, and that's sort of a theme we're following through each chapter. There are various communities of people that are making their own declarations of independence and their own constitutions, and kind of making sense of those founding documents, sort of translating those documents into their own political movements. And as it says at the bottom here, one of the main critiques is about this rising inequality. So as it says at the end, that for a quarter of a century, the rich have been growing richer, the poor poorer. The middle class will have disappeared as the struggle for existence becomes fierce and relentless. So it's this alarm at the gap, between the wealthy and the poor that has grown so tremendously in the late 19th century. So the populist movement and the People's Party became really influential in the South and the West. It did not have as much impact in the more industrial, urbanized Northeast. And part of the reason was that, the style of that political movement all came from the kind of culture of those more agrarian regions. And so, Eastern industrial workers didn't kind of respond to that movement quite as much. But the other reality was that some of the reforms they were calling for, actually, industrial workers didn't see that as beneficial, because what they were calling for was, pay higher prices for farm goods so we can make a living. Well, that will raise the cost of food for people who are buying that in urban areas, and will reduce, workers' wages in urban centers. So in some ways, some of their interests were kind of pitted against each other. Another thing that happens, and Foner talks about this a little bit later in the chapter, but just to note that the nature of labor unions were also changing. The Knights of Labor, with its kind of ideal of this big cooperative commonwealth, the sort of utopian ideal of that, has now kind of fallen apart. And you have a new organization, the American Federation of Labor, that says, let's focus on this narrow group of skilled white men in these kind of narrower set of industries. We can more effectively organize them and more effectively advocate for them. And unfortunately, though, that eliminates a lot of folks. That eliminates most non-white workers. That eliminates women. That's a much narrower, more exclusive view of who could be unionized. Eventually, you have another organization, the Industrial Workers of the World, that once again kind of returned to that broader vision of labor organizing, and they actually have more radical goals of actually to abolish capitalism. But that comes a little bit later. But by the end of the 19th century, the American Federation of Labor becomes kind of the dominant labor organization. Okay, so to turn to what's happening in the South after Reconstruction, remember that we talked a little bit in our meeting about the contested presidential election of 1876, and this leads to essentially the federal government stepping back from Reconstruction reforms and letting Southern states return to what they called home rule. And those Southern Democratic leaders often called themselves redeemers. And what they did as they came into power in various parts of the South is that they essentially dismantled most Reconstruction reforms. They dismantled the Civil Rights Acts of the 1870s. They dismantled a lot of the government support for institutions because they really were the Southern Democrats really believed in low spending and less government. So that means they cut a lot of funding from public schools. And most significantly here is that they also eliminated Black voting through, of course, they couldn't overturn the 15th Amendment, but they could start to enact various voting restriction laws, poll taxes. Later, you've got white primaries, which says that in the large election anybody can still vote, but in the primaries only white folks can vote. So because in the South the Democratic Party, I mean the South was essentially a kind of one party region during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, that meant that African Americans had very little kind of voting power. And they dismantle a number of other kind of civil rights protections, and the textbook talks about this much more thoroughly. But this is, and then you have the Plessy versus Ferguson Supreme Court case in 1896, which reinforces this system of what we now call Jim Crow segregation. You know, the clause separate but equal says, all right, it's okay to continue or to establish separate schools, separate train cars, you know, to segregate all kind of aspects of public and private space in the southern states. And the other thing that you see is the rise of lynching, the violence that that white redemptionists sometimes enacted on African Americans throughout the South. So Booker T. Washington, in this context, emerges as the most well-known Black leader in the country. And, you know, the textbook talks about his approach. And, you know, today when we hear some of the things that he was advocating, it seems quite contradictory, because what he was saying was, oh, you know, we kind of got ahead of ourselves trying to become state legislators, trying to get, you know, access to a kind of broad higher education. We really need to be more kind of focus on vocational kind of education, and focus on he had in some ways a more pragmatic view of how to advocate for African Americans. And in a speech called the Atlanta Compromise, he articulates this by sort of saying this phrase that he keeps repeating in that speech: cast your buckets where you are. And what he's sort of saying is that let's establish industrial vocational schools. Let's kind of make ourselves good good sort of workers in these industries. Let's not try to achieve kind of political leadership, um, and instead let's kind of build from the bottom up. Other African American leaders like W.E.B. Du Bois later would be very, very critical of Washington's approach, and thought that it was that he was essentially kind of excusing the sort of white segregationists. And various historians have kind of looked at there was sort of a debate between those two African American leaders during the early 20th century. And historians have interpreted in various ways. But one thing to consider is that Washington himself was born enslaved. He, in his mind, this was probably the only way to achieve any kind of power for African American communities. And so he thought a more gradual kind of approach was just the only thing that could be done. And as you can see in this kind of image of him giving the speech, he spoke to predominantly white audiences often, and he was trying to raise money for industrial and vocational schools that would serve African Americans. And so I think we have to consider the kind of that for him, he was trying to kind of work with the extreme limitations of living and pursuing benefits for African Americans within the Jim Crow South. But we will certainly have other African American leaders that emerge and challenge this view later on as well, and we'll talk about them as we get into the 20th century. The other thing I wanted to say a little bit about, the textbook talks about the convict lease system, and actually this was one of the draws of for some industries that were moving into the South. They said, well, we're going to move our plant into the South because we don't have to pay our workers high wages, so the wages are low, the taxes are low on us as corporate entities, and we can hire convicts from the state prisons for really, really low wages. And this was a system that was enacted throughout the South, starting in, it says here, it began actually in Alabama in the 1840s, but it really increases after the Civil War, and it lasts well into the early 20th century. It was a highly exploitative system. Convicts often did really, really perilous work. And it says here that sometimes their death rates were about 10 times higher than death rates of prisoners in states that did not have the convict lease system. And a lot of these workforces were also predominantly African American. And that's because with all of the other kinds of discriminatory laws, African Americans were much more likely to be imprisoned in the South, in other places as well, but particularly in the South. And so you had this system that really, in some ways, was some people called it another form of slavery, and we see this in Texas as well. So the most well-known example is in the building of the second Texas Capitol. So the Capitol that existed in the up through the 1880s burned in a fire 1881, so they had to build a new one. And the state said, well, let's lease some convicts to quarry the stone to help build the Capitol. And apparently a labor organization, the International Association of Granite Cutters, they were incensed about this, and they refused to work on the project. So these skilled workers who were unionized boycotted the project. That created a huge problem for the contractors. So the contractors went to Scotland and hired some stone cutters. But that was actually against the law. So there was what was called the Alien Contract Labor Act, which said you can't hire foreigners for this. So So the contractor was fined over, in what today's terms would be, over $1 million. And that gave the case kind of national attention. And so it did. So after that, the state actually kind of stepped away from convict lease, as a state. But there were a number of farms in East Texas, in particular, that continued to use the convict lease system, particularly around the area of Sugarland. And so, if you see the dome, the columns, the gate, some of the interior features of the Capitol were made by prisoners in Rusk State Prison. All right, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about immigration and exclusion. We see some major changes in immigration laws in the 1870s and 1880s. And these restrictions were mainly targeting Chinese workers. Now, we didn't talk about this quite as much earlier, but Chinese laborers were essential to building the Transcontinental Railroad. They built about 90% of the western half of the Transcontinental. And they had been coming to work on the railroad and work on various other kind of industries in California, primarily. And unfortunately, there was lots of kind of nativist reaction against those workers. There were a number of what you called anti-Chinese riots in California and a few other places. And as you can see, this is another kind of cartoon that shows the level of the kind of xenophobia of this anti-Chinese movement. They blame Chinese workers for all sorts of issues. They blame them as a threat to kind of white workers' rights. They said they're bringing in drugs, they're bringing in the opium trade, they're bringing in problems of prostitution and bribery and other kinds of corruption. And so a lot of white Americans portrayed Chinese workers as a threat. And this became such a part of the kind of dominant popular sentiment in the country that they started to enact restrictions. So in 1870, there's a Naturalization Act that specifically designated that the Chinese could not become citizens. Now, remember, naturalization and citizenship has long been kind of reserved for people who are classified as white. But after the Civil War, you have these changes where African Americans are now considered to be citizens. So in 1870, you have this other shift where they're specifically excluding Chinese from citizenship. And in 1882, they go even farther by banning immigration almost entirely. And so skilled worker, unskilled worker, it didn't matter. Chinese were not allowed to migrate after that act passed in 1882. And this is when you get this large shift from an immigration policies that generally before that were considered kind of unrestrictive. Lots of folks could come from lots of different places. Shift toward a much more restrictive immigration policy. And the textbook talks much more about other kinds of groups, Southern European groups that were kind of becoming the targets of immigration restriction, other kinds of restrictions based on mental capacity, sometimes on, there were efforts to ban people if they were accused of being, if they were considered sex workers. So there were other kinds of immigration restrictions that followed this as well. But this is a real shift and the first kind of so-called racially restrictive policy in the country. And we have a wonderful kind of local story about this, though. I say wonderful just because it's such a fascinating story of a man who kind of came to be known as Joe Sing, and he lived most of his life, or half of his life, probably in Austin. He was born Zhou Fengshen around 1860 in China. We don't know exactly when he migrated, but it was around 1880. and he arrives in Austin sometime around the turn of the century. We don't know quite when he marries, but he does marry a woman of Mexican descent, Francisca Moreno, but she was an American citizen. But when she married Josing, she lost her citizenship. And that is because it was at that time illegal for any American woman to marry a foreigner. So she, and that eventually was rescinded, but that wasn't until about the 1930s. But they did marry, and they had 4 children, and they established a laundry called Hong Li Laundry that was around 5th and Congress. And their family continues to be in Austin today. And there's been some wonderful work at the Austin History Center, and they did a documentary about the 5 generations of this family that have lived in Austin. I think maybe the 4th or the 5th generation of this family discovered a box that was in their daughter had kind of lived a long life, but she devoted herself to taking care of her mother, Francisca, and but she had a box that had the records of her parents that most of the family after that didn't really know anything about until they were kind of cleaning through her house after she passed away. And so they found this in about 2012 or so. And they found all sorts of other information about Josing's life. Apparently, he did have another family. He had children in China that he left. He probably left just like most Chinese men left China in the late 19th century in order to kind of make more income and send it back to their family. And so, indeed, Josing had these letters from his relatives, often kind of asking about money, because that was one of the reasons that so many Chinese migrated here, is because they needed to support their families. But and some of them returned to China, but some, like Josing, stayed and established second families. We don't know anything more about his family in China, but we do know that he did have another family. We also know that he lived in Galveston and New Orleans and Boston before he settled in Austin. And we know that he never was able to become an American citizen because of those restrictions. He died in 1927 after a hit and run accident. And the family's records is in the Austin History Center, and they did establish, as you can see here in 2010, a historical marker at the daughter's house, which is at 1705 East Willow. And you can see some of the story here, and as it says here in the marker as well, that that Josing kind of provided loans for other Chinese men, and so he kind of advocated for the Chinese community, even though the generations of the family after that, they predominantly kind of kept a lot of their Mexican American traditions, but didn't quite know as much about their Chinese and Chinese American traditions. But I think that's a really wonderful, interesting Austin connection to what we're talking about. All right, and so finally, I'm not going to talk about this in much detail because I'm going to have you listen to a podcast about America as empire and how and the Spanish-American War and the legacy of that. But I do want you to keep this illustration in mind. So this was actually an illustration that was kind of critical of American imperialism, but it's depicting the country as kind of a classroom with all of these different cultural groups. So the folks who are being depicted as the so-called kind of good students are there in the back, and they're kind of reading their textbooks, and those are really the European immigrants. You can see the kind of subjugation of African American kind of labor in that image of the African American person sort of cleaning the window behind the Uncle Sam as teacher. You can see indigenous people kind of represented on in the corner there, kind of being punished. And then you can see the kind of the Chinese worker being excluded, kind of outside the door. And then those four children that are in the front are really the focus of the illustration, right? And these represent these new territories that the United States acquired after the Spanish-American War, including Puerto Rico and Guam and Hawaii and the Philippines. And so they are being depicted as these kind of rebellious children, and the caption says something to the effect of, now you need to learn this lesson whether you like it or not, and I assure you, if you learn it, you will be happy just like the kind of good students behind you. So think about this illustration and how it kind of communicates who this country is, who is included in the kind of the rights of full citizenship in this country, and who is not. I think it gives a really insightful picture of the various challenges that different communities were struggling with in the US at the turn of the century. And I'll let you listen to the podcast for more details about that.